The sun had long set, but the hermitage remained bathed in a soft glow, as though the silence itself carried a light unseen. The disciples had begun to understand the weight of their teacher's words, not just in their meaning, but in the spaces between them. They spoke less, listened more, and found themselves at ease in the quiet that once made them restless. Yet, despite all they had learned, one disciple still struggled. He was young, eager, full of fire, and though he had embraced the practice of silence, he had not yet found peace within it. One evening he approached the teacher as the elder sat in quiet contemplation beneath the great tree. The disciple hesitated before speaking. "Master," he finally said, "I have remained silent. I have withdrawn from meaningless talk. But still my mind is restless. I feel as though I am standing at the edge of something, yet unable to step forward. Why does peace not come?" The teacher did not answer right away. He simply watched the disciple, observing the tension in his frame, the impatience in his eyes. Then he reached into the earth and picked up a handful of sand. "Close your hand around this," the teacher instructed. The disciple did as he was told, clenching his fingers tightly. Almost instantly, the grains of sand began to slip through the cracks between his fingers. "Now, open your hand," the teacher said. The disciple slowly loosened his grip. The sand no longer slipped away but rested easily in his palm. The teacher looked at him with knowing eyes. "Peace is not something you can hold on to by force. The harder you try to grasp it, the more it will elude you. But when you let go, when you stop trying to control it, it will settle within you naturally." The disciple stared at his open palm, watching the sand resting in stillness. A quiet understanding dawned upon him. "But Master," he asked after a moment, "how do I let go of something I do not even realize I am holding on to?" The teacher smiled. "By becoming aware, by watching your thoughts as they rise and fall, but not becoming entangled in them. When you fight your restlessness, you give it power. But when you observe it without resistance, it fades on its own." The disciple's breath slowed, his heart steadying. He bowed deeply, feeling something shift within him. Not an answer, not a solution, but an acceptance. From that night on, he stopped searching for peace. And in that stillness, peace found him. The days stretched into weeks, and the disciples continued their silent practice. But as with all things, silence too would be tested. One evening, travelers arrived at the hermitage, merchants from distant lands, their voices full of stories, their laughter breaking the quiet air. They had heard of the place of wisdom and had come seeking a glimpse of its teachings. One of them, a man of wealth and great renown, stood before the teacher and his disciples. "I have traveled far," he said, "seeking knowledge. I have read sacred texts, studied under scholars, and debated with the finest minds of my time. But I have heard that here, knowledge is found in silence. Tell me, what can you teach a man who already knows so much?" The teacher regarded him for a long moment before asking, "What is the purpose of all your learning?" The merchant's smile faltered slightly. "To understand the world, to gain wisdom." The teacher nodded. "And what have you understood so far?" The merchant hesitated, as though caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. "That knowledge is vast," he finally said, "that there is always more to learn." The teacher smiled. "Then you have learned much. But tell me, when do you stop seeking knowledge?" The merchant frowned. "Stop? Why would I stop? There is always more to discover." The teacher stood and gestured to the sky above. "Do you see the stars?" The merchant nodded. "Imagine you have spent your whole life chasing them," the teacher said. "You climb the highest mountains, build the tallest towers, stretch your arms as far as they will go. But no matter how high you reach, you cannot grasp them. What do you do?" The merchant was silent. The teacher continued, "There comes a moment when the wise man stops reaching, when he realizes that the stars were never meant to be held. They were meant to be seen, to be witnessed in stillness, not pursued in restlessness." The merchant lowered his gaze deep in thought. The teacher's voice was soft but firm. "Knowledge is like that. The more you chase it, the further it seems. But wisdom is not in the reaching, it is in the seeing." A hush fell over the gathering. The merchant, a man who had spent his life in pursuit of answers, felt something shift within him. A space opened, not in his mind, but in his heart. And for the first time, he did not speak. He simply listened. The travelers left the next morning, their voices quieter than before, their minds filled with something they could not. And the disciples of the hermitage remained, carrying the lesson forward, not in words, but in the stillness of their being. One by one, they began to understand. Silence was not an absence. It was not emptiness. It was fullness. It was the space where truth revealed itself, not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet of the soul. And once seen, it could never be unseen. In a peaceful village nestled between rolling hills and vast forests, there existed a grand ashram where a revered Buddhist teacher lived. The ashram was known far and wide as a place of deep wisdom and spiritual awakening. People from distant lands came to seek guidance, and disciples from different walks of life resided there, dedicating themselves to the pursuit of truth. Among them was one particular disciple who had a habit that made him stand out, not because of his wisdom or discipline, but because of his ceaseless talking. He could not hold his tongue. Whether it was during meditation, while performing daily chores, or when gathering alms from nearby villages, he would always find something to speak about. He collected stories from every house he visited, bringing them back to the ashram, sharing tales about others, gossiping, and even indulging in backbiting. This disciple had another peculiar trait. He always wanted to prove himself superior. He believed that he was different from the others, that he possessed a special intelligence that set him apart. "I was born into a wealthy family," he often reminded his fellow disciples. "If I had wished, I could have lived a life filled with luxury and comfort. But I left all that behind because I seek the truth, the meaning of life. My sacrifice is greater than yours." His words often created divisions, turning one disciple against another. Yet, in the presence of their teacher, he acted humbly, carefully choosing his words to appear as the most devoted among them. But the teacher, wise and observant, saw through his behavior. He knew that the disciples' endless speaking came not from wisdom, but from restlessness. One day the teacher called all the disciples to gather. As they sat before him, he spoke in a calm and measured voice. "For the next month, each of you will take a resolution, a vow that will test your discipline and strengthen your inner self. The resolution must be chosen according to your ability, and once taken, it must be followed with unwavering commitment. If any of you break your resolution before the month is over, you will return to your old ways, unchanged." The disciples nodded in agreement, understanding that this was a test of their willpower. Some chose to fast for certain hours, others decided to increase their meditation practice, while some resolved to refrain from anger or impatience. But the talkative disciple, unable to let go of his desire to stand apart, approached the teacher privately. "Master," he said, his voice filled with pride, "I do not wish to take an ordinary resolution like the others. I want a great resolution, one that challenges me, one that proves my strength. Tell me, what should I do?" The teacher smiled, his eyes filled with quiet amusement. "Are you certain?" he asked. "The resolution I give you may not be as great as you imagine. You may find it difficult to complete." The disciple straightened his back. "No matter what it is, I will fulfill it, Master. I am not like the others. My determination is unbreakable. The teacher nodded slowly. Very well. For the next 1 month you will remain completely silent. You will not speak a single word. The disciple blinked in surprise. That is all? He asked, almost laughing. Silence? That is too simple. I was expecting something greater, something truly challenging. The teacher's expression remained calm. First, complete this resolution, he said. Then we shall see. Still believing the task to be effortless, the disciple took his vow of silence that very moment. For the first day, it was easy. He felt a certain pride in his ability to remain quiet. But by the second day, an unexplainable weight began pressing upon him. By the third, his head ached with the effort of holding back words. He could feel the conversations happening around him, and yet he was unable to insert himself into them. By the fourth day, unease settled into his heart like a storm brewing beneath the surface. He wanted to share his thoughts, to comment on the discussions, to prove his intelligence, but his vow restrained him. His hands fidgeted, his eyes darted around, and in his silence, he realized something terrifying. He had never truly been with himself. He began to gesture dramatically, using exaggerated facial expressions to communicate, but it was not enough. The pressure inside him grew unbearable. His thoughts raced, his emotions twisted. He was drowning in his own unspoken words. Days passed, and the burden of silence grew heavier. His mind, once occupied with external chatter, Zrania now turned inward, and what he found within unsettled him. It was not peace, it was noise, an endless stream of unfinished sentences, of doubts, of insecurities he had never acknowledged. By the end of the first week, he could bear it no longer. He fell ill, unable to eat, unable to sleep. His breath felt heavy, as if silence itself had become a prison. He hurried to the teacher, picked up a piece of paper, and wrote his plea. "Master, I cannot do this. I feel suffocated. My mind is in turmoil. I am losing myself in this silence. What should I do? Should I break my vow?" The teacher read the words and smiled knowingly. "Resolutions are easy to take, but difficult to keep," he said. "Many make promises, but few have the strength to fulfill them. If you cannot bear this silence, you may break your vow. But remember, if you are unable to uphold something as simple as this, how will you ever control the greater struggles of your life?" The disciple's hands trembled as he read the response. He felt as though the words had struck something deep within him. He bowed and left, retreating to his hut, locking himself away from the world. He would not give in. He would not fail. Days turned into weeks. One by one, the other disciples broke their vows and returned to their normal routines. But he remained silent. The hermitage watched in astonishment. How had the most talkative disciple become the quietest of them all? After 15 days, he returned to his teacher, writing once again, "Master, I have not spoken a word, but my mind, it has not fallen silent. The voices within me are louder than ever. The more I suppress my words, the more they scream inside my head. Am I still keeping my resolution?" The teacher looked at him, his gaze filled with understanding. "Your vow continues," he said, "but know this, your mind is restless because it has never known silence. As long as you remain surrounded by the voices of others, your own mind will never be still. If you wish to experience true silence, you must go where no voices can reach you." The disciple bowed, understanding the path he must take. The next morning, he left the hermitage and walked into the deep forest. Days passed. The time of his resolution came to an end, but he did not return. The disciples of the hermitage grew anxious. Had he been lost? Had the dangers of the forest consumed him? They searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Some accepted that he was gone forever, but the teacher remained calm. When another disciple asked, "Master, do you think he has perished?" The teacher replied, "Perhaps the forest took him, or perhaps he found what he was truly seeking." Silence fell over the ashram, and somewhere, deep in the forest, the disciple sat alone, listening, not to the world, but to himself. For the first time in his life, he was truly silent. The days passed, and the hermitage continued its routine. The disciples meditated, performed their duties, and engaged in quiet study, but something was missing. The talkative disciple, who had once filled the air with endless words, had vanished into the silence of the forest. Some wondered if he had given up and returned to his former life. Others feared he had succumbed to the wilderness, perhaps taken by a wild animal or lost in the depths of solitude. But the teacher remained untroubled. He did not send search parties, nor did he speculate on the disciples' fate. When asked about him, he simply said, "He is where he needs to be." Far away from the hermitage, deep within the forest, the disciple sat beneath a towering tree, his body still, his breath slow. The silence around him was vast, untouched by human voices. There were no debates, no gossip, no need to prove himself. There was only the sound of the wind weaving through the leaves, the distant call of birds, and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. And yet, despite the quiet, his mind was anything but silent. It shouted at him. At first he had believed that withdrawing from the ashram would bring him peace, that without the noise of others, his own mind would settle. But the opposite had happened. The voices within him, his thoughts, his doubts, his regrets, grew louder than ever. They filled the space that external conversations had once occupied. They accused him, questioned him, tormented him. "Why are you doing this?" his mind whispered. "You are wasting your time. You have already proven yourself. What more do you need?" "Go back," another voice urged. "They will respect you now. They will see how long you endured." "No," a deeper voice countered. "You left because you needed to face yourself. Have you truly done that yet?" The disciple clenched his fists. He had come here seeking silence, but all he had found was noise. For days he wrestled with his thoughts, feeling as though he were fighting an invisible enemy. He tried to suppress them, to force them into submission, the stronger they became. And then, one evening, something changed. He was sitting by a river, watching the water flow over smooth stones, when he realized something. He had spent his entire life trying to control everything. He had controlled conversations, ensuring he was always the one speaking. He had controlled the image he projected, making sure others saw him as intelligent, superior. And now, even in solitude, he was trying to control his own mind, forcing it into silence. But the river before him did not force the water to move. It simply allowed it to flow. For the first time since his vow of silence began, he stopped fighting. He did not suppress his thoughts. He did not engage with them. He simply watched them as he watched the river. And slowly, something began to shift. The voices within him did not disappear, but they lost their power. They became like distant echoes, like leaves drifting upon the current, appearing, floating, and then vanishing without a trace. For the first time in his life, he understood what true silence was. It was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of attachment to sound. It was not an empty void, but a deep, vast presence, one that had always been there, hidden beneath the noise. That night, as he lay beneath the open sky, staring at the countless stars, he felt something he had never felt before. Peace. True peace. It was not the peace of winning an argument, not the peace of admiration from others, not the peace of proving himself. It was the peace of simply existing, Days turned into weeks, and the disciple no longer counted them. He had stopped measuring his progress. He no longer cared whether he had succeeded or failed in his vow, because he now understood that silence was not a challenge to be conquered. It was a way of being. One morning, after an unknown number of days, he rose to his feet, feeling the earth firm beneath him. He knew it was time. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply walked. When he arrived at the hermitage, the disciples were stunned. They had nearly forgotten the sound of his presence. But what shocked them most was not that he had returned. It was how he had returned. He was not the same man who had left. His face, once filled with restlessness, was now calm. His eyes, which once darted about seeking attention, now held an unwavering stillness. His movements were unhurried, his steps as steady as the earth itself. The disciples rushed to him, surrounding him, eager to hear what he would say. He greeted them warmly, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer hurried, no longer desperate to be heard. Each word he spoke was slow, deliberate, carrying a weight it had never held before. And the disciples felt it, not just in the words themselves, but in the silence between them. After exchanging a few words with his fellow disciples, he made his way to the teacher. He bowed low before him and then spoke his first words to him in what felt like a lifetime. "Master, am I still silent?" he asked. The teacher studied him for a long time, his gaze piercing yet kind. Then he smiled. "Yes," he said. "You are more silent now than you have ever been." The disciple lowered his head in deep reverence. "When I left the hermitage, I thought silence was merely the absence of words. But in the forest, I realized my mind was far louder than my tongue had ever been. I struggled. I fought. I tried to force it into quiet, but only when I stopped resisting did the silence finally come." The teacher nodded. "And what did you find in that silence?" The disciple exhaled, his chest light, his heart unburdened. "I found myself. Not the self I had created through words, not the self I had tried to prove. I found the self that exists beneath all that, and for the first time I did not need to explain it. I did not need to justify it. I simply let it be." A deep stillness fell over the hermitage, not forced, not disciplined, but natural, effortless. The other disciples, who had once been impatient with silence, who had once filled every moment with words, now sat in quiet awe. They had seen transformation before, but never like this. The teacher finally spoke. "As long as we seek to fill the silence, we will never understand it. But when we stop, when we listen, not with our ears, but with our being, then we will hear what has always been there." The disciple, once filled with noise, now understood the depth of those words. He had not just learned silence, he had become it. The disciple who had once been known for his endless chatter now carried a stillness that could be felt by all who stood near him. It was not a forced silence, not the restraint of someone holding back words out of discipline. It was the quiet presence of someone who no longer needed to fill the space around him with his voice. The other disciples were drawn to him, not because he spoke of great wisdom, but because when he did speak, his words carried a weight they had never held before, and more often than not, he did not speak at all. One evening, as the sky melted into deep hues of orange and violet, a younger disciple approached him. This disciple had watched the transformation unfold, but still could not grasp its depth. "I do not understand," the younger one admitted, sitting beside him beneath the great tree. "You were the one who spoke the most among us. You had a story for everything, a thought for every moment. And yet now you speak so little. How can you be at peace in silence? Does it not feel lonely?" The former talker smiled gently. "It only feels lonely when you are still searching for yourself in others' words," he said. "When I first took the vow of silence, I believed I was only restraining my tongue. But the true struggle was never with my voice, it was with my mind. The younger disciple listened closely, his brow furrowed in thought. In the beginning, the elder continued, I thought silence would be easy. But as I stopped speaking, I began to hear something far louder, my own mind. It did not fall silent just because my mouth did. Instead, it screamed even louder. It questioned, it doubted, it filled the emptiness with noise. The younger disciple nodded. That is what I feel too. When I try to be silent, my thoughts become unbearable. It is as if they are waiting for me in the stillness. The elder disciple looked up at the sky, his expression calm. That is because we have spent our entire lives running from them. We use words to escape ourselves. We fill the silence because we are afraid of what we might hear if we truly listen. The younger one remained quiet for a long time, absorbing this truth. Then he asked, "But how did you silence your mind? How did you make it stop?" The elder chuckled softly. "I didn't." The younger one blinked in surprise. "But you are at peace. You have found silence." The elder nodded. "Because I stopped fighting. I stopped trying to silence my thoughts. Instead, I let them come and go, just like the wind moving through the trees. I learned to observe them without clinging to them. And when I did, they lost their power." The younger disciple looked down, running his fingers over the grass beneath him. "So the silence does not come from making the mind empty?" "No," the elder replied. "It comes from realizing that the mind was never meant to be empty. It was only meant to be still." A breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves. The younger disciple closed his eyes, listening, not just to the wind, but to the quiet space within himself. For the first time, he did not try to suppress his thoughts. He did not try to force stillness. He simply listened. And in that listening, he understood something. Silence was not about the absence of noise. It was about the presence of awareness. That night, as the disciples sat together under the open sky, the teacher finally spoke. "There is a question that many of you still hold in your hearts," he said, "a question about the purpose of silence." The disciples sat up attentively, eager to hear his words. "We have spoken much about silence," the teacher continued, "but silence is not the goal. It is only the path. Many believe that to be wise is to be silent, but wisdom is not in silence itself. It is in knowing when to be silent and when to speak." The disciples exchanged glances, considering this. The teacher continued, "Some seek silence because they believe it will make them superior, but silence used as a shield is no different from words used as weapons. If your silence is meant to avoid truth rather than embrace it, then it is no silence at all." A hush fell over the gathering. The teacher's gaze fell upon the former talker. "Tell me," he said, "when you were in the forest, did you ever break your silence?" The disciple lowered his head slightly, recalling the moment. "Yes, Master. There was a day when the silence became so vast, so complete, that I felt the urge to test it. I shouted into the emptiness, expecting to hear an echo or to disturb the peace." "And what happened?" the teacher asked. The disciple smiled faintly. "Nothing." The silence remained. It did not break. It did not change. It simply absorbed my voice and continued as it was. The teacher nodded. "That is the nature of true silence. It is not fragile. It does not disappear when words are spoken. It is always there, beneath the surface, waiting for us to return to it." A deep stillness settled over the group, not forced, not disciplined, but natural. The teacher spoke once more. "When you speak, let your words come from a place of silence. Let them be deliberate, filled with meaning, rather than scattered like leaves in the wind. And when you are silent, let it be a silence that listens, that understands, that does not simply wait for the next moment to speak." The disciples sat in quiet reflection. Each of them had believed that silence was something to be achieved, something that could be forced through restraint. But now they saw it differently. Silence was not something to be held, it was something to surrender to, and so they did not ask more questions, they did not try to prove their understanding, they simply remained, still, aware, silent. The hermitage had never been truly silent before, though the disciples had always practiced quiet meditation. There had always been an undercurrent of restlessness, subtle, unseen, but present. But now, after witnessing the transformation of one of their own, the silence had taken on a new depth. It was not an absence, it was a presence. The disciples no longer feared it. They no longer filled the air with unnecessary words. They no longer spoke simply to be heard. And in this stillness, something extraordinary happened. Wisdom, which had once seemed so distant, began to emerge on its own. One afternoon, as the sun cast golden light across the ashram grounds, a traveler arrived. His robes were fine, his posture proud, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who believed he had seen all there was to see. He stood before the teacher, his voice strong and sure. "I have heard much about this place," he said. "They say that wisdom is found here, that enlightenment can be reached through silence. I have traveled far in search of knowledge, debating with the greatest minds of my time, and so I ask you, what is the greatest truth?" The teacher did not answer. A long moment passed, the air heavy with expectation. The traveler frowned slightly. "Do you not have an answer?" he asked. "Or is it that you do not wish to share it?" Still, the teacher remained silent. The traveler let out a short laugh. "Ah, I see. This is your lesson then. That truth is found in silence, that words are meaningless." He shook his head. "A clever trick, but I have met many scholars who have tried to hide their lack of knowledge behind silence. If you truly have wisdom, then speak it." The teacher finally looked at him, his eyes calm and unwavering. "If you already believe you know what wisdom is, why do you seek it?" The traveler's smile faltered slightly. "Because there is always more to learn." The teacher nodded. "Then listen." And with that, he said nothing more. The traveler waited. He expected words, explanations, arguments, but none came. The disciples too remained silent, not out of discipline, but because they understood that nothing needed to be said. The traveler shifted uncomfortably. The silence stretched, growing heavier by the second. A strange feeling crept into his chest, something he had never felt before. It was not frustration, it was not impatience, it was fear. Not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of facing himself. For years he had filled every space with conversation, with debate, with certainty. He had sought truth in words, believing that the more he spoke, the more he would understand. But now, standing here in this unbreakable silence, he felt something he had never expected. Doubt, not in the teacher, not in the disciples, but in himself. The teacher finally spoke, his voice as gentle as a breeze. "What do you hear?" The traveler frowned. "Nothing." The teacher shook his head. "Listen again." The traveler fell silent, forcing himself to pay attention. At first, he heard nothing but his own thoughts, loud, chaotic, unsettled. But as he continued to listen, he noticed something else. The distant chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the soft, steady rhythm of his own breath. And beneath it all, something deeper, something he could not name. His heart began to pound. He had spent his entire life searching for truth, expecting it to come in the form of grand revelations, of profound statements spoken by wise men. But now, in this silence, he realized something. Truth was never something to be spoken. It was something to be felt. His hands trembled slightly. He took a slow breath, then another. And for the first time in his life, he did not try to argue. He did not try to prove himself. He simply listened, and in that listening, he understood. He bowed deeply to the teacher, his voice softer than before. "Thank you." The teacher smiled. "You have found what you were looking for." The traveler left the hermitage that evening. He had come seeking knowledge, but he left with something far greater: understanding. The disciples watched him go, their hearts filled with quiet awe. They had seen many seekers come and go, but never before had they witnessed a man transform so quickly. It was proof of what they had begun to realize, that silence was not just a practice. I tried to fill the silence with my own thoughts, my own questions, but the more I tried to control it, the more restless I became. "And how did you finally find peace?" The elder disciple smiled. "I stopped trying." The younger one furrowed his brow. "That's all?" "That's all." A cool breeze passed through the hermitage, rustling the trees, whispering between them. The disciples sat together in the fading light, no longer needing to speak, for they had seen the truth with their own eyes. Silence was not a burden. It was not a test. It was a gift. And those who truly listened would always find what they were seeking. The traveler had long departed, yet the echo of his realization lingered in the hermitage, like a quiet ripple in still water. The disciples had witnessed something profound, not through grand teachings, not through elaborate debates, but through the sheer weight of silence itself. For days after, the hermitage remained steeped in a deeper stillness. The disciples no longer sought to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Even when they spoke, they did so with a newfound awareness, as if each word was a stone carefully placed rather than a handful of pebbles scattered carelessly into the wind. One evening, as the last traces of sunlight melted into the horizon, a young disciple sat beside the elder who had once been the most talkative among them. The younger one had been struggling. Though he had embraced silence, his mind remained restless. He turned to the elder, his voice hesitant. "I have been silent, but I still feel as though my thoughts are louder than ever. No matter how much I resist them, they will not leave me." The elder smiled gently, as if he had been expecting the question. "That is because you are trying to control them," he said. "You are treating silence as something to be forced, as if the mind will obey simply because you demand it." The young disciple frowned. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The elder looked toward the sky, where a few wisps of clouds drifted lazily across the stars. "Tell me," he said, "do you try to control the wind?" The young disciple blinked in confusion. "No. The wind moves on its own." The elder nodded. "And yet, when it blows, you notice it. You feel it against your skin. You hear it rustling the leaves. But you do not resist it. You do not try to stop it. You simply let it be." The young disciple listened carefully. "The mind is the same," the elder continued. "Thoughts come and go like the wind. You cannot force them to disappear, just as you cannot command the wind to be still. The more you resist, the stronger they become. But when you stop fighting, when you simply observe them without attachment, they pass on their own." The young disciple was silent, absorbing this. The elder chuckled softly. "I once believed that silence meant the absence of thoughts, that if I could stop thinking, I would finally be free. But when I went into the forest, I realized that thoughts are not the enemy. It is our attachment to them that creates noise." The younger one furrowed his brow. "Then, if we do not fight our thoughts, if we do not silence them, what do we do?" The elder gestured to the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. "We watch," he said simply. "We listen, and we let them come and go without clinging to them." A hush settled over them, not forced, not strained, but natural. The young disciple closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time, he did not try to suppress the thoughts that rose in his mind. He did not try to chase them away. He simply let them pass, like clouds drifting across an endless sky. And in that moment, he felt it, a space between the thoughts, vast and boundless. He exhaled slowly, opening his eyes. "I think. I understand." The elder smiled. "Then you have taken your first step into true silence." Days passed, and the young disciple practiced this new awareness. He no longer strained to quiet his mind. He no longer feared his own thoughts. Instead, he watched them rise and fall, coming and going like waves upon the shore. One afternoon, as he sat in deep contemplation, he heard the sound of raised voices. Curious, he followed the sound until he reached two disciples who stood facing each other, their expressions tense, their voices sharp with frustration. "I have told you already it was a mistake," one of them snapped. "And yet you continue to act as if it is not important," the other retorted. "If you truly respected our practice, you would have been more careful." The young disciple observed them in silence. Their words were loud, but their true battle was not with each other. It was with themselves. Each one sought to prove something, to assert their rightness, to shield themselves from the discomfort of being wrong. And then he understood. The noise of the world was not just in words, it was in the emotions that fueled them, in the need to defend, in the need to win. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice calm but steady. "If silence can teach us anything, it is this. When we speak from restlessness, we only create more restlessness." The two disciples turned to him, their anger momentarily halted. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. The young disciple took a breath. "If your words are born from ego, they will never bring peace. You are both speaking, but neither of you is listening. You are not seeking truth. You are seeking to be right." A hush fell over them. The anger that had filled the air only moments ago now felt misplaced, unnecessary. The first disciple exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted. The second disciple sighed, his shoulders dropping. "I did not realize how much I was trying to defend myself." The young disciple smiled. "Silence is not just about withholding words. It is about understanding why we wish to speak in the first place." The two looked at each other, then bowed in gratitude before walking away. Their dispute dissolved without another word. The young disciple watched them go, a quiet sense of peace settling in his chest. He had always believed that wisdom came from the great masters, from profound teachings, but now he understood something else. Wisdom also arose in the space between words. That evening, as the disciples gathered beneath the stars, the teacher spoke. "You have all walked the path of silence," he said. "Some of you have resisted it, some of you have embraced it, but tell me, what have you learned?" The young disciple, who had once struggled against his own thoughts, bowed his head before answering. "I have learned that silence is not the absence of speech, it is the absence of conflict." The teacher smiled. "And where does conflict arise?" "From within," the young disciple answered. "From the need to prove, to justify, to defend." The teacher nodded. "Then you understand the lesson." A deep hush settled over the gathering. It was not an empty silence. It was not the silence of restraint. It was the silence of understanding, and in that silence, the greatest truth of all was revealed, not in words, not in teachings, but in the stillness that existed beyond them. The disciples did not need to speak further. They simply remained, present, aware, silent. The night was deep, and the hermitage was wrapped in stillness. Not the forced silence of discipline, but the natural quiet of understanding. The disciples had begun to see that silence was not an act of restraint, it was a way of being, a presence beyond the need for words. The young disciple who had once struggled against his thoughts now sat peacefully among his brothers. His heart no longer waged war against itself. He no longer sought to silence his mind, nor did he let it control him. He had learned to observe, to listen, not just to others, but to himself. But silence, like all things, would soon be tested. The next morning, an old man arrived at the hermitage. He was hunched with age, his clothes worn and covered in dust from the road. His eyes carried a weight that could not be explained in words. He stood at the gate, looking at the disciples with an expression of deep sorrow. One of the disciples approached him. "Welcome, traveler. What brings you here?" The old man took a long breath before speaking. "I have traveled far, searching for peace," he said. "But wherever I go, I find only more suffering." The disciple gestured for him to enter, leading him toward the great tree where the teacher sat in quiet meditation. The old man bowed low before him. "Master," he said, "I have heard of your wisdom. I have heard that those who come here find peace. Tell me, how do I escape the pain of this world?" The teacher opened his eyes and studied the man for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, he pointed to a nearby stone. "Pick up that stone," he said. The old man, confused but obedient, reached for the stone and lifted it into his hands. "Now," the teacher continued, "carry it with you everywhere you go." The old man frowned. "But master, the stone is heavy." The teacher nodded. "Yes, and so is your pain. Yet you insist on carrying it." A hush fell over the disciples as the words sank in. The old man stared at the stone in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "But master, how do I put it down?" The teacher smiled. "By realizing that you were never meant to carry it." The old man's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the stone once more, then slowly, carefully, placed it on the ground. And as he did, tears welled in his eyes, not from sadness, but from release. "I have held on to my suffering for so long," he whispered. "I thought it was part of me, but now I see. It was only something I was holding." The teacher nodded. "And now that you have let it go, what remains?" The old man wiped his eyes. "Peace," he whispered. "For the first time in my life, I feel peace."